Latin, the language of the Romans. For hundreds of years, this was the dominant language in Europe, in the age of the Roman kingdom, then of the Roman Republic, and later of the Roman Empire. This is widely known, and many people have to learn the works of the golden age of Latin in school, the works of Cicero, of Virgil, Horace, or of Livy. But what happened to Latin during the course of the centuries of the Roman Empire's existence in the West? How did Latin change over the course of that time? Was Latin in the late Roman Empire still similar to that of the early empire? And what happened once the Western Roman Empire fell? How did that affect Latin? And lastly, how and when did Latin evolve into the Romance languages of Europe that hundreds of millions of people, not only in Europe, but actually across the world, speak even today? When we speak about Latin, we must define what we actually mean by Latin. If you would ask someone on the street what Latin is, they probably would say the long-dead language of the old Romans. Latin, by its definition, is an Indo-European language which developed in the area of Latium, modern-day Lazio, the area surrounding Rome. Through the expansion of the Romans, the language consequently also expanded and was brought to all the areas that the Roman Republic and later the Roman Empire had conquered. It is of course immediately clear that Latin must have changed in its very long history. Rome was founded in 753 BC, and even in that time archaic Latin had already developed, which then transformed over the centuries into Old Latin and then later into Classical Latin. Classical Latin is the form of written Latin that many had to learn in school, which is magnificently showcased in the works of Cicero or of Virgil. But even then, the evolution of Latin was of course not over, since the Roman Empire lasted in the West for 500 years, half a millennium, and we know that a lot can happen in such a long time. We only have to look at how different the European languages sounded 500 years ago from today. And so Classical Latin slowly evolved into Late Latin, which can be defined as a form of more simplistic written Latin, which was used from the 3rd century AD onwards until around the year 900 AD. But more on that later. So we already see that when we say Latin, it is not so easy because just as any other language, Latin itself developed over the course of the many centuries when it was used as the official language of the Roman Kingdom, then the Roman Republic, and lastly of the Roman Empire. But if you thought that this was already complicated, then it gets even weirder, because of course there was quite the difference between written Latin and spoken Latin. We have an idea of how Latin sounded, but of course I will make an entirely separate video about that. However, suffice it to say that it can be reconstructed from surviving writings from the Roman era how Latin must have sounded. Take the name Cicero as an example. We know that the C was pronounced as K, so the name would have sounded like Cicero and not Cicero, which is how it would be pronounced in ecclesiastical Latin. That is the form of Latin that survived through the Roman Catholic Church. But the interesting part about spoken Latin was that it was basically a simplified form of written Latin. Not so different from today, where we speak differently in everyday language than what we would write in an essay or in a scientific paper. Until the 19th century, it was actually thought that spoken Latin was really very different from written Latin and that it was, for all intents and purposes, like its own language. In reality, vulgar Latin is really just spoken Latin, the Latin of the everyday people of the Roman times throughout Europe. So what you would have heard a merchant say to another, or a soldier, or even a slave say to another. Logically, regular, everyday people would not make use of elaborate and complicated grammatical constructions, as this would be far too cumbersome and complicated and time-consuming in order to convey a message in clear, concise and simple terms in spoken form. For instance, the sentence, "Marcus is giving me his father's book," would in written classical Latin be Marcus mihi librum patris dat, but in spoken or vulgar Latin, this would have been simplified to Marcus mi da libru de patre. To make matters even more complicated, after the 3rd century, when the empire was hit by huge crises and Christianity rose to power, even written Latin changed. It became more simplified. Why? Well, Christianity needed to convey its message in simple terms that everybody, people of all classes and societal ranks, could understand. And so, of course, using extremely complicated and beautiful stylistical forms became impractical, especially in times of great calamities, when there was simply no time or energy for such grammatical wordplays and constructions. And so, late Latin, which is the simplified written form of classical Latin, was used from the 3rd century onwards, even to after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So to sum it up, in the late Roman Empire, say in the year 400 AD, if you would look at a map of the spoken languages, this is how it would look. The East was predominantly Greek-speaking, while the West was Latin-dominated. And this Latin was separated into written Latin and spoken or vulgar Latin. And the written Latin again had become late Latin, which was a simplified form of classical Latin. But classical Latin was still sometimes used, especially by pagans who strived to be like their role models Cicero, Vergilius, Horatius, and the likes, from the golden age of Latin in the 1st century BC. So we can already see that the situation was quite complicated. Hello dear friends of late Roman history, it's me, Sebastian, the creator and the person behind Maiorianus. I apologize for this brief interruption, but I wanted to ask for your help to support Maiorianus and to support the channel so that we can keep Maiorianus a channel about late Roman history. As you know, the YouTube algorithm is often not very kind to niche topics such as late Roman history, and therefore I really need your support in order to keep Maiorianus the way it is, to keep it a channel about late Roman history, so that we can continue to explore this most fascinating era of the late Roman Empire, and so that we won't have to turn Maiorianus into a mainstream history channel. Thanks for considering to support me via Patreon or via YouTube membership. I cannot thank you people enough. I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Majorian himself would be proud. Thank you friends of late Roman history, and back to the video. After 407 AD then, when the Germanic invasions of the Western Roman Empire began, with different Germanic tribes managing to establish themselves on previously Roman territory, it is of course quite clear that this would also have an influence on Latin. This influence was, however, as long as the Western Roman Empire still existed, of course quite limited in nature. The Germanic languages and spoken Latin continued to exist side by side, not yet mingling into a new form of language. Even in the 500s AD, spoken Latin was still probably very similar to what it was a century earlier, when the Western Empire was still intact. At Rome, Boetius, Symmachus and Cassiodorus were the last writers of a classical Roman caliber, where we would say that they were still upholding the classical Latin writing style, even as late as the 520s. In the East, the Emperor Justinian and his legendary general Belisarius were in fact native Latin speakers, showing that even in that time, Latin was still used as it would have been 200 years earlier, even in the predominantly Greek Eastern Roman Empire. From Procopius, who accompanied Belisarius on his campaigns, we actually get some interesting insights into the language and customs of the times. When Belisarius reconquered the lost Roman province of Africa in 533 AD, which had been conquered by the Vandals some 100 years prior, he stated that the native inhabitants of the Vandal kingdom were still speaking Latin and considered themselves to be Romans. So even after almost a century of Vandal occupation, the spoken Latin had still not diverged from the spoken Latin of Belisarius. Belisarius, in his African campaign, had absolutely no trouble interacting with the locals, speaking Latin with them, as stated by Procopius. So we see that even in the early 500s, spoken Latin in the former provinces of the Western Roman Empire had still not changed a lot. However, this was all about to change, because the next 200 years would see an uninterrupted series of gigantic disasters which would upend the old order of things. First, there was the plague of Justinian in the 540s that killed millions in the Roman Empire and also in the former territories of the by then non-existent Western Roman Empire. Then, the Italian peninsula was utterly plunged into darkness by a decades-lasting war that killed countless people, forcing many others to flee and transforming entire cities into ghost towns, thus ending the old classical Roman institutions in Italy for good. Many of the surviving native Latin speakers then fled to the east, hence further reducing the strength of the native spoken Latin. Then the disasters went on as the east was under attack from all sides, and by the mid to late 600s, this formerly vast empire had shrunk dramatically, losing many provinces to new enemies. This brought with it a dramatic decline of the strength of Roman culture and influence, and by that time in the east, Greek had become much stronger, therefore overshadowing the use of Latin, the use of which then further declined. In the former Western Roman Empire, meanwhile, by the 600s, the different Germanic languages would now slowly start creeping into the local spoken Latin. But of course, this also worked the other way around. The Germanics would also adopt Latin, often mixing it with their own Germanic language. For instance, in the Frankish-controlled territory, the Gallo-Romans, after more than a century of Frankish influence, would slowly start adopting some words from the Frankish language, and vice versa. Hence, the spoken Latin slowly started changing. In the territory of the Visigothic kingdom, meanwhile, words of the Visigothic language would of course start creeping into the spoken Latin there. And here too this would also happen the other way around, consequently resulting in a divergence of the spoken Latin in Visigothic Spain as compared to Frankish Gaul. And this effect took place in all territories that were controlled by different tribes, all of which saw words of these tribes slowly start to mingle with the spoken Latin in their respective regions. And so without the guiding power of the Roman Empire, which in the previous centuries had ensured a strong cultural influence of Rome, and thus Latin had been the guiding language, without that guiding power of the Roman Empire, the spoken Latin of the different former provinces of the Roman Empire started diverging ever more strongly, slowly starting already in the 500s in some territories, but then really accelerating in the 600s and 700s AD. Thus, the Proto-Romance languages, so the precursors of the Romance languages, started forming in that time already, first very slowly, but by 800 AD, we can assume that different Proto-Romance languages had already evolved. Meaning that in the Frankish kingdom there was a Proto-French language spoken, whereas on the Iberian Peninsula we would find Proto-Spanish and Proto-Portuguese. The Romanians are a weird outlier here because it is still a matter of debate how and why that language managed to retain such a high similarity to spoken Latin, despite being part of the Roman Empire for not even 200 years. I made a video about that fascinating anomaly. However, even in 800 AD, written Latin can still be considered to belong to late Latin, meaning that the authors still try to keep writing in the same Latin style as in the late Western Roman Empire. Sure, the Latin was maybe not as pure anymore, but it can still be considered to have been late Latin. It was then really only incredibly late, around 900 AD, that the authors would then start writing in the newly evolving Romance languages, and written Latin started retreating to ecclesiastical Latin, which was henceforth only used in cloisters or monasteries, so by monks and church officials in general, and of course by the Vatican itself, which maintained its Latin heritage by a continued use of written late Latin. Proto-Romance then of course continued to evolve into the different Romance languages that we have today. And fascinatingly, if we look at a map of Europe where Romance languages are spoken, we can clearly see that each and every one of those regions was formerly a part of the Western Roman Empire. And we can even see that often the border of the Roman Empire is still today the border of the Romance language speaking regions. It is wild to think that 1,500 years after the end of the Western Roman Empire, its influence still lives on in the very languages that we speak. But of course, Latin still exists today, and in the Renaissance, humanists had adopted Latin as the language of scholarship, and so Latin was continued to be used especially in medicine, but also in some other scientific fields as the language of choice. Even today, this supposedly dead language is still far from dead. It is still being taught at school. Of course, we are talking here about written Latin of the golden classical age of Latin of the 1st century BC. But there are even some people who speak Latin, and that community of Latin speakers is apparently still growing. So the history of Latin is an utterly interesting field of language research, and we can just see how big the influence of the language of the Romans still continues to be on our daily lives. Many of us speak Romance languages, which are an evolution of spoken or vulgar Latin, and so the cultural influence of the Roman Empire shows itself once again in the most spectacular fashion. And please like and subscribe so that you won't miss any future videos on the fascinating era of the late Roman Empire. And I would like to thank our new Augustus supporters, Kimberly Perotis and Eddie Xavier. Thank you so much, Kimberly Perotis, for your generous support of Maiorianus. I am always happy to see women also being interested in Roman history. And thank you so much, Eddie Xavier, for your equally amazing support. And I would like to also thank our new Kaisar supporters, Kazamo, Sebastian T, and Matej Babiak. Thank you so much, Kazamo, Sebastian T, and Matej Babiak for your generous support. And I would of course like to thank everyone who is supporting Maiorianus in any form, through Patreon, YouTube membership, or through a PayPal donation. Thank you so much, friends, for supporting Maiorianus so that I can keep this a channel only about late Roman history. And if you want to learn more about the reconquest of the Vandal kingdom, you can watch this video here in the upper right corner. But if you want to learn more about the Frankish kingdom, you can watch the other video in the lower right corner. I say thanks again to all friends of Roman history, gratias tibiago and bene valete.